On June 3rd, 1985, 13-year-old Kerry Loggins was getting off the school bus in front of his house on Highway 150 in Summerfield, North Carolina. Kerry remembers a black truck as he walked from the bus to his house. The back half of the truck was upright in a horse pasture. Moments later, he heard a very loud sound, and then he was laying on the ground, and the sky turned black. Law enforcement and emergency personnel were even running for cover. A Chevrolet Blazer had exploded about a football field's length from where Kerry was. As he started to run, things started to rain down around him. It was car parts and bomb parts and body parts. And he saw a man in a ditch, and the man was missing his right arm and his leg, but he wasn't dead yet. A detective leaned down toward the man, and he was hoping for some type of confession, but he just gurgled some blood and he died. All that remained of the lady was her torso. He didn't see the young boys that were strapped in the back with gunshot wounds to the head or the family dogs. He felt something under his feet, so he looked down, but he couldn't make out what it was. Was it a kidney or part of an arm? He didn't hang around to find out, and then he ran home and he stayed inside for days. His mother cleaned the blood from his new white shoes that he had on that day, but he couldn't wear them after that, and he still deals with mental trauma. There was a patch of burned asphalt in front of their house that was charred by the bomb, and he said that it was there for what seemed like an eternity. This case is one of the most complex, brutal, and bizarre murder cases in North Carolina's history, and it can also get confusing because of all of the names. This case was so notorious that there was a book written about it by Jerry Bledsoe, as well as a two-part miniseries. I remember watching the miniseries, but it was a very long time ago. Now, let's get into it. In the Blazer were Susie Newsom Lynch, Frederick Klenner Jr., also called Fritz, Susie's sons, John and James, who was called Jim, and the family dogs, two chows. Susie was the daughter of an R.J. Reynolds executive named Bob Newsom. R.J. Reynolds is a tobacco company in Winston Salem, North Carolina. She was named after her aunt Susie Sharp, the first woman appointed as a Superior Court judge in North Carolina, and later the first woman to serve on the state Supreme Court. Susie grew up in Winston-Salem. She went to Queens College in Charlotte, North Carolina for 2 years, and a professor there said that Susie would stop by his office to chat at the end of the day, and one time he stepped out, and when he came back to his office, Susie had rearranged all of the pictures on his wall that were of the British royal family. When he told her that she should have asked for his permission, she got really angry. She screamed at him and said that they weren't in the proper order. He had never seen that look in her eye before. He said that she looked like she could have killed someone. Growing up, Susie was obsessed with the royal family. She would have extreme temper tantrums as a kid, and her mother would have to throw cold water on her to try to get her to calm down. And she never learned delayed gratification, and she was described as spoiled and snobbish. When Susie transferred from Queens College to Wake Forest University, which is also in Winston-Salem, she met Tom Lynch. They get married and they moved to Lexington, Kentucky, and Tom was accepted into dental school at the University of Kentucky. And between his studies and her job at a research firm, the couple spent little time together. Now fast forward to 1974. Susie gives birth to a son named John, and they were living in Beaufort, South Carolina at this point because Tom had joined the Navy Reserve. 2 years later, she gives birth to James. And a few months later, Tom opened a dental practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Susie hated it there, and she wanted to move back to North Carolina. She resented being stuck home with 2 small sons while Tom spent long hours getting his practice off the ground. And she would talk about her prominent, wealthy family back in North Carolina, and she criticized the locals for their lack of culture and their fashion sense. She was really something else. Susie physically abused her sons. One day Tom came home from work and he noticed that John was holding his arm in a strange position. John had a broken arm. He told his dad that he fell off of a bed at the babysitter's, but the babysitter never let the kids on any of the beds because her husband was home sleeping because he worked nights. The bedroom doors always stayed closed. John never asked the babysitter about it because if he had, he would have known the truth and he could have gotten the kids away from Susie. She even pretended to take the boys to the doctor. Their son Jim suffered a concussion that same year, and he didn't want to believe that Susie would hurt their boys. Tensions between Tom and Susie grew and they fought a lot, and they eventually got a divorce. Tom wanted more visitation, but Susie said no. She and Fritz thought that Tom wanted to take away the boys permanently. They were in horrible shape. They were starved for affection, and they weren't even allowed to play outside. Tom rarely saw his boys, and when he did, they were sickly and fearful. By the end of the year, Susie and the boys moved to China, where she taught English for 6 months, and nothing was to her liking there. When she and her sons returned to Greensboro in 1980, Susie was thin and weak, and her mother told her to go see her uncle, Dr. Klenner, for treatment. So she called Tom and told him that she wouldn't be returning to Albuquerque. And after moving out of her parents' home, Susie moved into an apartment with her first cousin, Fritz Klenner. Their apartment in Greensboro was crammed with vitamins, prescription drugs, and weapons. When Tom and his wife Kathy were fighting for custody, Tom asked the boys if they'd like to spend more time with them. They said yes, but if they mentioned it to their mom, they'd end up with broken arms. Dr. Fred Klenner, Fritz Klenner's father, was from Pennsylvania, and he married Susie Sharp's sister Annie, but was never fully accepted into the Sharp family. He was controversial and eccentric. He had segregated waiting rooms well into the 80s. He would defend Hitler any chance he got, and he said that he knew the exact date that the world would end. He treated multiple cases of polio and pneumonia with very high doses of vitamin C. Vitamin C was his thing, and he was known nationally for it. The dosage for his vitamin C therapy ranged from 6,000 to 20,000 milligrams in a 24-hour period. He was a chest specialist, but he worked mostly as a general practitioner, and he also delivered a lot of babies throughout his career. But Dr. Klenner died of a heart attack in 1984. Dr. Klenner and a nurse named Margaret Ware participated in the delivery of the Fultz quads, and they were the first identical black quadruplets on record. They were born on May 23, 1946 at Annie Penn Hospital in Reedsville, North Carolina. Their births made news all across the country, and Dr. Klenner took it upon himself to name the girls after women in his family. Their mother, Annie Mae, was deaf and mute, and their father, James, was a sharecropper, and they would go on to have 11 children in all. So Dr. Klenner would set up visitations at the girls' home for strangers, and they were put on display in a glass-enclosed nursery. Dr. Klenner, not the parents, was awarded a contract with Pet Milk, and the company compensated the parents when the girls were young with 4 sets of identical clothing, medical care, a nurse, food for the girls, and a farm that was barren. Timber wouldn't even grow on it anymore. I have 2 aunts that went to school with them, and I remember seeing them in one of their yearbooks. The last one born, Catherine, was also the last one to die. All 4 died of breast cancer. The quads each had only 1 child because they were afraid that they'd have multiple births. There's a lot more to their tragic story, but I'll save that for another video. As a child, Fritz stayed close to his father, whether he was with him at the office or on hunting trips, and he desperately needed his father's attention. So as punishment, his father would withdraw that attention. Fritz was a mess. He pretended that he was a Green Beret, a prodigy, a medical student, a doctor, and a CIA agent. When he graduated from Reedsville High School, he went to the University of Mississippi in Oxford, but he didn't graduate. His father wanted to see his diploma, so Fritz made up a story that his enemies in the German department had conspired to keep him from finishing his degree. He lied and said that he had straightened that situation out, and he pretended to graduate, and then he pretended to enroll in medical school at Duke University. His father was so proud because that's where he went to medical school. Fritz's friends called him Dr. Crazy. When Tom did get to see his sons, they were thin, withdrawn, fearful, and loaded down with large quantities of vitamin C. And Tom was remarried at this point, and he decided to take legal action to boost his visitation rights. And Susie was deteriorating mentally, and she had become obsessed with keeping her sons away from her ex-husband and his new wife. And Fritz told people that he would do anything that he had to do to protect Susie and to see that she got to keep her boys. He was planning a trip to kill Tom under the guise of being a CIA counterintelligence agent assassinating drug dealers. In July of 1984, Dolores Lynch, Tom Lynch's mother, was shot outside her 14-room home in Louisville, Kentucky on Covered Bridge Road. She had just come home from church. Dolores was described as blunt and outspoken. At 4'11" and 100 pounds, she was a tiny, energetic woman that was known to be a penny pincher. Even at the age of 68, she kept her 4-acre property immaculately mowed, and her home was as immaculate as her lawn. Her body was found lying beside the garage, and it had been outside in the summer heat for 24 hours. She was found by a friend that had been trying to reach her, and when she couldn't, she drove over to check on her. Dolores was shot at close range with a high-powered weapon, so you can imagine how the blast destroyed her face and her head. Pieces of her skull and her eyeglasses were found 15 feet away, and there was blood splatter on the garage door. When police arrived and went inside the home, they found Dolores' 2 Yorkies barking, and they could tell that they were hungry and thirsty. And her dogs were her constant companions. They were her babies. They also found the body of her 39-year-old daughter, Dr. Jane Lynch. She too had been shot to death. She heard the shots and came to see what was going on, but as she ran, she was shot in the back. She made it to the kitchen and she tried to use the phone, but Fritz was right behind her. She ran around the counter, over the dog gate, into the den, and down the hallway where she tried to open a closet door to set off a panic alarm. She ran into her mother's room, around a bed, and through some French doors into the sunroom. She had nowhere else to hide. She was in a crouching position when Fritz shot her in the neck, and she died instantly. A bullet had driven one of her hair rollers into her head, and there were no fingerprints and no empty shell casings were left behind. It looked like the work of professionals, and with $50,000 Persian rugs, televisions, and tape recorders untouched, investigators knew that these killings had nothing to do with the robbery. As Tom was leaving his dental office for the day, the Albuquerque police chaplain introduced himself and told him that he had some very bad news for him. His mother and sister had been murdered. The day of the murder, Susie called to postpone a test schedule for that evening. The reason she gave? Death in the family. Police had few clues to work with until 10 months later, and 500 miles away, 3 members of another prominent family were brutally murdered. Robert Newsom III and his wife Alice had been trying to reach his parents at his grandmother Hattie's house, but no one was answering the phone. They were spending the weekend with her near Winston Salem, which is something that they usually did. His parents were supposed to pick up their granddaughter Paige and bring her home. At 5 o'clock, they still hadn't arrived, so Alice's mother called and asked if she should go ahead and feed Paige. They told her yes. So Rob thought that maybe his father had forgotten, so he drove to downtown Greensboro, where his father's office was, to see if he had stopped off there before heading home, but he wasn't there. At 8 o'clock p.m., they drove to Kernersville to pick up Paige. They went back home and tried to watch some TV, but they couldn't concentrate, so they kept calling his grandmother. But his wife's mother suggested that they call his grandmother's close friends, the Suttons, that lived a few miles away from his grandmother. At 10:20, Dr. Sutton and his wife arrived at the house, and they were walking to the back door when they noticed some broken glass, and he knew then that something bad had happened there. He peeked in the window, and at first it looked like Florence and Hattie were asleep in front of the TV, but then he noticed the blood on the floor, but he didn't see Rob's father. He knocked on the window, and when they didn't respond, he assumed that they were dead, so he was worried that the killer may still be in the house, so he and his wife left and went to a neighbor's to call 911. Dr. Sutton called home and told his son to call Rob III, and police arrived 30 minutes later after being called for a second time, and they found Hattie's body laying on a sofa covered with an Afghan. And Robert Jr. was found in the hallway, and Florence Newsom's body was at the foot of the couch. Robert Jr. had planned to testify in court on May 23, 1985, in favor of John getting more visitation. Unfortunately, he ended up being buried that day. When Rob III found out that his parents had planned to testify for Tom Lynch, he told Susie, who then told Fritz, who started loading his guns. And he said that for years and years he felt like a murderer. Fritz bragged that he had committed the perfect crimes. He told friends how he covered his tracks by ransacking the homes to look like a robbery, how he picked up the spent shells to slow down police, and how he altered the barrels of his guns to make it impossible for them to be linked to the murders. Fortunately for the cops, Fritz was an arrogant idiot. He used a nickel-plated Colt AR-15 assault rifle, which is a weapon whose barrel can be easily replaced. When authorities found the gun, they were able to positively tie Fritz to the Lynch murders. He did everything right except getting rid of that gun. The murders had several similarities. The victims were shot in the chest, the back, and the head. The shootings came days before Tom was supposed to take John and Jim to visit their grandmother. When Tom heard that his ex-wife's relatives had been murdered, his mind jumped back to July when his own mother and sister were killed in the same way. Tom said that he immediately called the police in Kentucky and said, "You better check out this Fritz guy." Tom was questioned and he took a polygraph test to quickly prove his innocence. The $250,000 inheritance from his mother could have been a motive. Hattie Newsom left a fourth of her $900,000 estate to Susie, whose children were the indirect beneficiaries of the estates of Dolores and Jane Lynch. A fourth is $225,000. Susie and Fritz fueled each other's paranoia and delusions, and things just spiraled out of control. It sounds like a case of shared psychosis. The two were acting so weird that her family started thinking that she was involved in the murders, but no one alerted the police. In 1985, Fritz convinced 21-year-old Ian Perkins that he was in the CIA, and Ian knew Fritz growing up. He was his neighbor, and Fritz was even a mentor to him. He knew Fritz to wear camouflage, talk about weapons, and how much he hated communists, so it wasn't a stretch for Ian to believe Fritz. He told Ian that he was working on a CIA mission involving drug traffickers in Winston Salem, and he needed his help. I mean, who would lie about something like that? Fritz told him that he'd evaluate his performance to determine whether he would be worthy for other missions. And Fritz was going to interrogate some communists from Central America who were stealing weapons from U.S. arsenals and selling them to buy drugs to sell at a profit. So on the night of the Newsome murders, Ian drove Fritz there, and he was the getaway driver, and he really believed that he was part of a CIA mission. Those drug traffickers turned out to be Susie's parents and grandmother. Ian knew them, and he liked them. Once he realized the truth, he risked his life to help solve the case. He wore a wire to see if they could get a confession from Fritz. So on June the 3rd, Ian Perkins got into Fritz's car and recorded their conversation. It was the closest that anyone would ever get to a confession. Ian was the only person to be convicted because the killers would be dead within a few hours. Ian served 4 months for being an accessory after the fact. He also was on probation. And to this day, Ian is still embarrassed about how he believed Fritz's story. Forsyth County deputies, Greensboro, North Carolina police, State Bureau of Investigation agents, and Kentucky State Police were all following Fritz to Susie's apartment in Greensboro. Now, the Kentucky State Police were in town to question Fritz about the Lynch murders. They watched Fritz and Susie load the Blazer with camping supplies, and then they put Jim, John, and the family dogs, 2 chows, inside. They moved to arrest them on June the 3rd at the intersection in front of Guilford College. And once they got on the road, Fritz then led them on a 10-mile chase down Highway 150, which is north of Greensboro. And he opened fire on police officer Thomas Johnson with an Uzi. He was smiling the entire time with sunglasses on. People nearby heard gunfire, clicks, and then an explosion. A bomb that was under the passenger seat had been detonated. In the wreckage, a cocked 9mm pistol was found leaning against a tree, and this was the gun that shot the boys. It was later determined that John and Jim were dead before the explosion. Gun residue was found on Susie's hand, and the boys had ingested cyanide. The FBI couldn't say if she shot the boys, but she did fire the gun at least once. And there was a cover-up by the FBI and the various police jurisdictions over the responsibility for the deaths of the boys. Some questions asked were, why did the police attempt to confront Fritz when Susie's 2 sons were in the Blazer, and knowing that he was well armed? They said that the tinted windows prevented police from knowing that Susie's 2 sons were in the Blazer. The Kentucky police, in their initial investigation, weren't informed by North Carolina officers of Fritz's background, and that information could have saved lives. The chief of Louisville investigation was furious when he found out that information was withheld. He traced one of Fritz's weapons to its new owner. He had it tested ballistically, and it solved the Newsome murders. Investigators in North Carolina didn't make that effort because, as far as they were concerned, the case was solved. The killers were dead. The medical examiner said that in his opinion, the boys were unconscious but alive when they were shot. He immediately noticed the bitter almond scent of cyanide when he started the autopsy. The boys had probably ingested the cyanide a few minutes before they were shot. Tom got married for a 3rd time, and they have a daughter named Ari, and he retired from his dental practice in 2014. He sued the law enforcement agencies and officers involved for deliberate indifference and recklessness. He said that John and Jim were let down by everyone who was supposed to protect them. Their bodies were transported to New Mexico and buried.